So now let's go down the chain, and we're going to address some of his anterior knee pain, right? So he's been talking about that. In this case, there's a couple areas that relate to that anterior knee. Usually it's overactivation of the quad muscles, right? So if we think of muscles as chains of muscles, right? So no muscle is just independent by itself. There's usually a chain. So we think of muscles in terms of an anterior chain and a posterior chain on the most simplistic spectrum of muscle activation. So if we think of those chains of muscles like a rubber band, right? And if we stretch a rubber band, it has potential to do work, right? So if we manipulate either the ankle joint or the hip joint, we're changing the length of one of those chains, right? So if I toe point, I'm stretching the anterior chain. That means that this chain, or my quad, has more potential to do work. My posterior chain has less ability to do work, right? If we're talking about potential. If we anteriorly pelvic tilt or posteriorly pelvic tilt, usually it's more posterior pelvic tilt that creates some of this anterior chain to lengthen or stretch, so then it has more potential to do work. In this case, when Steve started, he had that posterior pelvic tilt, which means that it's shutting off the glute because it's shortening that glute. It's lengthening the anterior chain. So now his quad has more potential to do work, right? We also see that at his ankle joint, he's got this extreme toe point, which again is lengthening this anterior chain, so it has more potential to do work. So the knee joints are stuck in the middle with this overactive quad is now overfiring and is putting a lot of tension around that anterior knee, and that's what's happening, or that's more than likely why he's presenting with some of those anterior knee symptoms. So we've already corrected some posture up here. We've given him some anterior pelvic tilt. That allows his glute to do more work because it's stretching that glute tissue. And then in this case, the only area then to solve is at the ankle joint, right? So in this case, some people will just say, some fitters will just say, let's just focus on flattening the foot. Well, one, we have to make sure he's got range of motion there. So in this case, drive your heel as much as you can. So in this case, he's got plenty of range of motion at the joint. So we know that in Steve's case, it's not limiting him. So he has the range of motion at his ankle joint. So there's two ways we can look at it. Change the ankle joint. Okay, that may mean, and we've also anterior pelvic tilted his pelvis, so he may have potential for his posterior chain to work. However, I found that just by changing and manipulating the joints doesn't mean that the chain fires perfectly. Sometimes you have to ask it to do it. So in this case, if we have Steve pedal, right, and I want you to, in the downstroke, try to focus on producing the power from your glutes. So, nice. And when he does that, naturally the heel kind of drives, right, and he's able to flatten out that foot, and that tells us that the ankle becomes very passive because he's using that posterior chain, and that's a good thing. Go back to trying to produce the power at the foot-pedal interface, Steve, with that stiff foot. And can you feel how your quad does more work?
Definitely.
Right? So we're actually working in real time, manipulating the joints and feeling the tension change or the activation of those muscles change. All right, now I want you to focus on just pedaling, and I want you to start to posteriorly tilt while you're pedaling. And right away, when he does that, his foot gets a little more stiff, and Steve, can you feel more activation of that quad and less of the glute?
Yes.
Right, so he's manipulating that chain length when he plays with his pelvic tilt. Right, and it's a little different how much pelvic tilt every individual has and what is neutral to them. But in this case, Steve has a little more anterior pelvic tilt, and in real life, he has more anterior pelvic tilt. And in this case, getting more glute activation for him will help with relaxing that ankle joint, letting the foot be a little bit flatter and less toey, and that'll help reduce his overactivation of the quad, which will reduce then the anterior knee pain.